Well, hey, good afternoon to you guys. Welcome back once again. It's good to see everyone. Welcome to the Crazy Gibberish live stream. How y'all doing today? I'm doing fantastic. I got a guest in studio today on stream with me. He's a fan of the channel and he's a friend of mine. And if you don't know him from the Discord, Russ, do you mind me telling people what your handle is on the Discord and in the audience?
Don't dox me, bro.
I'm gonna dox you, bro. I'm gonna dox you live,
I'm just
bro.
kidding.
So
No, go for it.
This is the volcano god himself. This is a close personal friend of mine, Mr. Rusty Schafer, and we're gonna hold court on some AD&D topics that are near and dear to his heart today. We'll take your questions. We will give your answers, and we're just gonna have fun for the next hour and 15 minutes. Just whatever Rusty's comfortable doing. I'm here for you guys. So normally this would be the part in the show on a Tuesday where I would jump into this big, long explanation of what happened in last night's epic Monday night AD&D game. But we're going to save that. We're going to wrap that up in a little bit of foil, and we're going to set it in the fridge, and we'll heat that back up on Thursday. Because tomorrow night, co-host Kyle Schuant will be here, and we'll get to hear the Antipodean side of what's going on in role-playing games. But until then, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my guest, Rusty Schafer. Rusty!
Hey, nice to be on the show. After watching it so many times, so great show as always. I'm just kidding. Yeah, no, happy to do it. Maybe we could do this more often too.
I would love to, man. I would love to. And you know, that generally speaking, that goes for most of my audience. We as a whole, we are a crowd of folks who love our AD&D, and most people who reach our age bracket, not going to name any particular numbers, I don't think that's necessary, but you know, we've all formed some pretty foundational and concrete opinions on AD&D. And so when I say, if you, the broader you folks out there, ever really want to come on the show and really waste an hour of your time in the middle of the day, please let me know. But Rusty's got some opinions on AD&D, thoughts, misconceptions, that sort of thing. And I want to lead it off, Russ, with a little bit of something that happened last night. We've got a high-level bard in the party, and there's always pop music jokes flying around, like the party was fighting an Arctic snake, a furred snake, in the mountains last night. And so he said, I'm going to play, because bards can play a song, and after 2 rounds, it gives the party a +1 on all their 2 hit. And so we always joke about, depending on the enemy or situation, what song he's going to play. You know, like if they're fighting a dragon, it's like, hey, you're going to play Dragon Attack by Queen, that sort of thing. And so he said, well, I'm going to play some White Snake. And then just in the middle of it, he posts a message and says, what would the karaoke, what would the D&D equivalent of karaoke be? And I believe it was Alan Groh. He said Critical Role would be the D&D equivalent of karaoke. And I thought about it, and as funny as I thought that was, I think that's right. I think that's correct. I think that Critical Role is D&D karaoke. You're not really singing along. You know, it's just kind of a performative lark, not LARP, although they do dress up in costumes, I guess. So what is your take on AD&D versus what's being offered as D&D these days? Like, do you think there are misconceptions about AD&D that go into people saying, no, I'm going to play 5th edition because Matt Mercer and costumes and prom D&D modules?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So to back up and contextualize this a little bit from my point of view, I embarked this summer on a project where I decided I'm pulling all my notes out and maps and everything from my 90s AD&D campaign, and I am going to put it all into virtual tabletop, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that got me, and as you're exploring virtual tabletop options and looking what's out there, you start to see like, hey, from an AD&D perspective, there's not a ton of great stuff out there. There's one in particular I hit on later, but I think that got me thinking about what is the state of AD&D today, compared to games that came before it, games that came after, and then, what's the future of AD&D? Like, what does that look like? And so that's kind of the context I came in this conversation with. So great question. I think when you look at like the streaming stuff and Critical Role, and that choice of like what version of D&D to get in with. I mean, I think some of that's just really simple. That 5e is what's on the bookshelves. 5e is like kind of just, if I'm curious and I just type into Google like, oh my god, I saw this really funny video of this guy with a hat DMing. I have no context for it. It just looks like fun to me, right? I have no history on the game. What are they playing? Oh, they're playing this. I want to get it. Like, I think it's that simple, right? I don't think people are making the choices necessarily between like 5e or 1e. Like, I don't think they're even presented with the choice. Now, the person who does the deep dive, like the like big time hobbyist, that person starts going down the rabbit trails and finds out, oh man, this game's been going on since 74, and that kind of stuff. I don't think the average person getting into this stuff has any clue about any of that. That's kind of my take on it.
Well, I think, first of all, I agree with you. I think there is a disconnect between what I see being presented out there and what is what we do as the hobby. Again, people go out and they look at Dungeons and Dragons and they don't see what we see of the hobby. I think there has been perhaps, and I could be wrong about this. I'm no marketing expert. I'm no statistics expert, but I will share a little bit of insight. The shows like Stranger Things, and I think Stranger Things is probably the guide on the standard bearer for old school D&D. I mean, look, I think you and myself and everyone else is aware those kids, the cast on screen, what they were doing was not playing D&D. They were just, the producers just said, here, say this and roll a 20-sided die. They weren't like legal characters or anything. No, I get it. But at the same time, all their props are classic D&D. And those kids, as I've said before, in that show are our age now. Like, that's us in 1983. We're all 12, 13, and 14 years old. So, they're hitting us where we live, as the old saying goes, and showing off, a dungeon board game, showing off Grenadier miniatures, showing off a true first print monster manual that Dustin was using to explain the Mind Flayer to Hopper. All those are relevant points. And last summer, not this past summer, a year ago this past summer, when I launched my company, Guide Key, which is a corporate team building by way of playing AD&D company.
Yep.
If anyone's interested in that, message me. But my first client, Jeremy Roll, and he's actually been on this show, who had me run a game for his team. We ran White Plume Mountain. He asked me about why I was promoting this as, we'd be playing classic D&D. And I broke it down on the website and I explained it to him, and he said, no, that's good. Vintage is huge.
Sure. No, that absolutely it is. Absolutely.
And I want to know your thoughts on if you think there is room. Now, folks, I've said this 1,000 times, and I'll say it again. It will never be 1978 again. No matter how fervently we wish it could be, it will never be 1978 again in terms of our hobby. All right, you're not going to wake up tomorrow and find out that Wizards is thrown in the towel and is selling first edition AD&D exclusively again, or even second edition. It'll never be 1988 again, or 1998. And I'm fully aware of that. But do you see, Rusty? Do you see a position with this upcoming cycle, because a 6th edition is going to hit before or exactly at the 50th anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons, which is rapidly coming towards us. But do you see an in for AD&D, for classic D&D? And if so, what is it? Just hit me with a wisdom.
Oh, we can totally go there. I think the first question, maybe we can talk about this separately, is you have to ask yourself, like, why do you want an in, and why do you want it to be more popular? And that might drive the outcome. Like those outcomes might drive like the tactics we take, right? So if it's like, I want it to be more popular so I have more people to play with, that's an outcome. I want it to be more popular because I want more products to be available to me, that's an outcome. You know, so I think it's important to be kind of crisp on that specifically. But I'll set that aside for a minute and the types of things. I think, you know, when I look at D&D as it stands today, I'm going to throw out a major hypothesis here, is that the growth or lack thereof of the like AD&D player base is directly tied to the foray into the availability of digital tools for AD&D. And I think when you look at the audience, the evolving audience over decades, like, it's really hard to jump in and get vested into a game that has like little to no digital presence. Like, you know, great, like just a very specific example, go to Roll20 and set up an AD&D game. Like, it's like one of the shittiest character sheets on Roll20, right? You know, with like no other support.
Right.
Things like that. Like, dude, if I'm exploring this stuff and I'm kind of on my own and getting into it, and I look and I've got D&D Beyond with all this crazy stuff for 5e. I've got, there are other, like big time support for VTTs, et cetera. Man, is it really hard to go with, when my first impression is this, crappy character sheet on Roll20, for example. And I'm not dogging whoever made that sheet. I'm sorry if you're on watching the stream. Am I gone?
No, we got you back. We had a little network hiccup here. Please continue.
Okay.
You were talking about the crappy character sheet on Roll20.
Yeah, so I was just making an example. Like, you go to any of these, virtual tabletop companies, look at, they all do like an annual report. It's like, hey, here are the games played on our platform. And you'll look and, no surprise, it's like 95% 5e, and then there'll be like everything else falls into 5%. I'm not looking at the chart right now. It's probably a little different, but directionally what I'm saying is true. And you look at the 5%, and it's like split up between like 20 games. And then you look at like the, like the small slice for classic D&D, and it's literally like split into like 6 different categories under that, right? Like, it's just ridiculous. But I think it's just, it comes back to, just lack of digital tools. Like, what if there were something like D&D Beyond, let's say, something like that? Now, it's not going to be for AD&D specifically, right? Because of, IP, et cetera, but you could certainly have an Ozark, or you could have an Ozark version of it, let's say, right? Like, why couldn't you have that? Why not, why not pull together and make some really great tools for Roll20? Another super popular VTT I've talked about on the Discord a lot is Fantasy Grounds, right? And actually, Fantasy Grounds does have a classic D&D rule set it's based on AD&D, actually 2nd edition. But you can go there right now, and I could sign up right now. I could buy White Plume Mountain and run it for my friends today, right? Like, that is completely badass. There is a member of the community, EOTB,
Yes,
who
we know
has
him,
spent-
EOTB on the Discord.
Dude, I have no idea how much time this dude spent on. He has basically, created and automated or I should say, converted and automated like all the Ozark content for the Fantasy Grounds platform to literally, you want to, you start an encounter. It's like, boom, I drag an encounter over to the map. Here it is. You kill them. It rolls all their treasure for you. You just click a button, you assign, et cetera, assign the XP to the players, divide the treasure. Like it's amazing, right? It's that kind of stuff that we've got to be doing, I think. And I think there is a window. What did they say? 2024 maybe is the target for like a new edition of D&D. You mentioned 6. I didn't know if they called it 6 or had some other name or whatever, but yeah, I just would love to see us, have a better digital presence by that point in time. And to me, I think more than anything, that's what's kind of holding, AD&D back.
Well, I definitely think there's some absolute truth to that. Now, for our listeners at home, I'll tell you this straight up. Rusty and I are very proximate to one another, and as I said, no secret, we're friends. And it drives Rusty up the wall because I am the Phil Hartman unfrozen caveman lawyer when it comes to my approach to digital tools in D&D. I still run Dungeon Master's Assistant Volumes 1 and 2 under DOSBox X for those are my digital tools, and PDFs.
Yeah,
are my digital tools.
Dude.
Here's the thing. 99.9% of America wants to get up in the morning and go out to their car and put the key in and turn the ignition and drive someplace, leave that place, get back in their car, turn the ignition, and drive home. Some of my favorite YouTube videos are guys, and I'm in that 99.9%, I should point out. Some of my favorite YouTube videos are guys who go out and find cars that have sat abandoned for 40, 50, 60 years. And they spend like 4 hours with a handful of wrenches and a couple of cans of ATF and some brake cleaner. And then they drive they drive the cars out of these holes that they find them in. And then they keep them running, but they require constant fiddling with and attention and that sort of thing. And there's usually a reason they were parked. Not everybody wants to do that. A diminishingly small number of people want to do that. And that is the equivalent of what I do with 2 tools written for DOS 3.3 in 1990. It's not easy to use. You absolutely are 100% right, Russ, when you talk about people wanting and needing to have a turnkey solution to play their AD&D games. And I would have hoped that WotC would have embraced the idea of yes, all editions, and said, okay, there's this great digital frontier, and we can do more than just preserve AD&D in a jar. Now, I think it's magnificent that this day, you can push a button, pay $24, and a couple of weeks later, this arrives at your house. All right. It doesn't smell like cigarette smoke. It's not coated with pizza grease. The corners aren't beat to death. It's crispy and in brand new shape. And you can do it with all of the classic AD&D books and most of the classic AD&D modules. But we come back to what you're talking about. Digital tools. That still doesn't cross the hurdle of game prep. And I mean, I was talking on the Discord this weekend about creating a castle. I did a castle encounter. Now, I had a lot of fun doing it, and I wouldn't have used digital tools to create this encounter of 50 bandits, their high-level leaders, their treasure, the type of castle, the amount of money each soldier has, etc., etc. Even people who love AD&D don't have the amount of free time that I have. I probably shouldn't have the amount of free time I have, but that's for another discussion. And that's kind of where we're at. I think the event horizon with your digital tools initiative that you're pushing, getting things in to VTT like you're doing.
Yeah, and so to touch on this, and it's going to sound like my crosshairs are partially on you, and it's not what I'm going for here. But okay, let's say I'm this person who's kind of interested in D&D. I go on Amazon and Google it. What am I getting? I'm getting 5e books, right? And just Google it, period. I'm getting 5e stuff. If I do the deeper dive, and I run into AD&D, and I start searching for it, what do I find? Right? I'm going to find like the visible communities I'm going to find talking about this, kind of the thought leaders, if you will. Like, man, I want to say this and not be offensive, but like the general sentiment that you find in these visible communities is like a reluctance to embrace like anything that's happened technologically since 1983. Like I want a Dead Tree book. I won't read a PDF. I know you're not that way. We don't do streaming. We don't care about this or that. We don't do virtual tabletops, right? So that's what I find when I start Googling, right? And I'm like, okay, this is just not for me. I'm going with Critical Role. I'm going with 5e, etc. So I think if you want to, your ability to acquire new people in the hobby, they've just got to find something more like welcoming than that, or more in tune with like modern sensibilities than that. It is what it is, but I think what I said is pretty accurate. If you just Google, AD&D and start reading forum posts and comments and stuff like that, you'll definitely get that impression, right?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And as recently as 4 or 5 years ago, the playing field was fairly even, and I could go and run events down at Gods and Monsters or wherever and get people who had never played AD&D to sit down at the table, play AD&D, love AD&D, and then say, if you want to run this, go get PDFs. Go get yourself some PDFs, get stuff print on demand. And they'd say, hey, yeah, that sounds great. But now there is a raft of digital tools for 5e. Now I know if I say that, I'll have to give it the caveat, but you're not going to find the support for virtual tabletops. And in the age of Andromeda strain, even with states like Florida and others opening up even more where you can go to events, that's a deal breaker for a lot of people. And it's not that you can't just grab something as simple as Discord. And this is something I haven't talked about this in a while. You really only need some kind of voice communications to play on a virtual tabletop. You don't need fancy cameras or lights or even software. But for a lot of people, that's as good as being there for them, and they want that, and that's not there for AD&D, but for initiatives by people like you and people like EOTB doing things in Fantasy Ground.
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely important. I think having something, like I said, obviously we're not going to have like some huge development team working on this or whatever, but something like a D&D Beyond, like really simple, like would just be amazing, like for Osric. Doesn't have to be like super crazy, but it's got to be online, and it has to be, has to kind of check the boxes, right?
Right.
But, versus, trying to run DM's assistance in a DOS box, like, that kind of stuff, right?
Again, that's a case of that. I know how to do, like, I know how to make that work. That's like, to go back to the car revival guys, it's like, if you put me behind the wheel of like the 1974 Maverick, Ford Maverick, that one of the guys has as his daily driver, and said, drive this a mile up the road, I'd get like 100 feet and it would quit because I didn't know.
Yeah.
It's like I didn't know to like tease it between first and second to get the throw out bearing to just engage enough to let me shift in the next gear. And it's the same way. Like I can say, yeah, here's Dungeon Master's Assistance Volumes 1 and 2. That's all you need. And people on game night would just be like furiously double clicking the executables, wondering why Windows keeps throwing up an error saying, I can't run this, dude.
Yeah.
So I completely get it. But with what with what you've been doing, with what the folks over in Fantasy Grounds have been doing, I think we're getting there. I don't know that we're there yet, but I think we're getting there.
Yeah, I think the Osric modules for Fantasy Grounds is like a huge win for AD&D, and I bet you like hardly anyone, like there's probably 10 people that know about it.
Yeah,
right?
That's definitely like, something that the word should be spread on. And hopefully it's going to become just a misconception. People say, well, no, the entry point for AD&D is too difficult. It's just the bar is too high. You guys are gatekeeping too hard, and I can't. If I'm gonna have to carve a boat out of a tree trunk every time I want to play AD&D, I'm not going to do it. Are you finding that there's a lot of misconceptions, regardless of whether or not it's virtual tabletop? I just mean about D&D in general and people's acceptance of it. Do you find on your side of the house that there are a lot of misconceptions about AD&D, like falsehoods or anything like that?
Dude, there are a million of them.
Well, hit me.
Kind of
hit us.
Researching stuff. Before we leave the digital tool thing, one last comment on that.
Sure.
I think at this point in time, and looking at things, from where we are today, if you produce, a module, like a new adventure module for Osric or actually for anything, doesn't matter. It's almost, to me, unacceptable at this point to produce it, to produce a module that does not have like a digital shareable map that you could use on Roll20, for example, and tokens. Like, actually, for myself, I disqualify it. Like, I look at like Drive Through RPG or DM's Guild or whatever and look at modules, and it's like, hey, if this doesn't have, if it doesn't have the assets to where I could play it on Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds, like, I'm not even going to buy it. And I'm sure I'm not alone in that sentiment, right? And I think that's a sentiment that's growing. So just another thing I think we can do. In terms of, to pivot over to the misconception stuff, I think there are a lot of things and I've just kind of written these things down as I've gone along, like I'm researching stuff. And I think there's a ton of misconceptions out there that just get repeated over and over. So we could dive into one. I think any of these we could probably spend an hour on. So I'll start at one point here. We'll see where we get.
Sure.
Fair enough?
Sure. Okay. Absolutely.
Okay. One misconception I see all the time, and look for this yourself. Just, do a search for AD&D versus BX or AD&D versus OD&D. Just Google that, and what I'm about to say, you're going to see left and right, which is there is this sentiment that original D&D, basic, the clones based on those two are far easier to mod and hack than AD&D. False. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think it's absolutely false. The tools are only as good as the craftsman. And I think, a lot can be said for having a 7/16 and 9/16, an adjustable wrench, vice grips, and a couple of different size screwdrivers, Phillips head and flat. And you can say, this is all I need to fix a car. But isn't it nice? Isn't it nicer if you have a lift and an engine hoist and a wrench, a wrench for every size?
No, absolutely. The sentiment you'll see is like, I prefer to start with OD&D or whatever because it's easier to add then subtract. It's like, dude, like complete BS, right? Like it's far easier to have all those tools and decide which ones you're not using, which totally okay in AD&D, right?
Exactly. And
Totally okay.
this goes back to what I've said, and I know I've talked to you about this before, Russ, is the helmet rule. Why
Yeah.
spend money on a helmet in AD&D? It doesn't do anything. There's no rules for it. So I'm not going to bother buying a helmet. Well, the rule for it is in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and it very much says that, look, that big pumpkin of yours sitting on top of your shoulders is armor class 9.
What are you, a freaking bugbear?
That's a good one, though. The big jack-o'-lantern head bugbears from OD&D,
Yeah.
which the pumpkin head bugbears were at, you could actually at the Dungeon Hobby Shop, I'm told, sold. I think it was Dave Sutherland cast some pumpkin head bugbear miniatures that they sold at.
Dude, that is amazing.
But probably poor cast rather than spin cast. But I don't know.
It's amazing.
It is. So, so the helmet rule, you don't wear a helmet, you get your head bashed in. Well, suddenly, the reason for having helmets in the player's handbook makes a lot of sense. So if you're just looking at the player's handbook and you don't bother reading the rules and you just delete helmets from the player's handbook, and then you wonder why, or your players start to wonder why they're getting their heads bashed in, that's a perfect example. And Kyle and I have talked about this, and I've talked about this, of pulling a part out of AD&D without understanding what it does. Now, if you decide that stopping every combat round and rolling a d6 to determine whether or not a monster is going to be striking at a character's head or their body slows your game down, you'll just assume everyone's wearing a helmet and monsters won't bother, and the helmetless people are in the front line fighting anyway, then that's an example of doing away with a rule by understanding what it's doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But imagine trying to graft in a helmet rule into OD&D if you're not looking at AD&D.
No, totally. I just think AD&D, like, there's just so much there that, I think you can take away and it still works fine. You can add to it. It still works fine. Like, if you're realistic about AD&D, it's like, this thing sort of evolved through like campaign play to a point, right? And then I think they got to a point where they're productizing it and wrote a bunch of stuff for it or whatever. I think there's a lot of sound, like mechanics and things that work really well together in AD&D, but certainly no one has ever like play tested every class to every level with every race combination and every magic item. You know what I mean? Like there are things that, like there isn't like, the way I'd put it, there isn't like some, ingenious algorithm behind the scenes that like, you switch one lever here and the whole thing falls down. Like that's not the case. Like, you can go, like, I think you can just as, like, I guess my overall point with this topic is you can just as easily, tweak AD&D as you can any other, game in the D&D family through whatever, 2001 or whenever AD&D officially kind of ended. But like anything from like 74 to like 2001, dude, you can, I think it's equally modifiable. I just have never gotten the, OD&D is cleaner somehow or easier to add to. It sounds like something that just gets like repeated, and I just don't see the evidence for it.
Well, I was quite the music snob back when I worked in record stores, and what everybody, if you've ever worked, and this is an age that's past because, unless it's like a little neighborhood CD shop that has been there since the dawn of time, who goes to a music store anymore, right? They're deader. Yep. They're deader than hobby train shops. But everybody who wasn't just a seasonal employee who worked at even at corporate record stores, Peaches, Record Bar, Musicland, so on and etc. everyone who worked there for an extended period of time, myself included, was a huge music snob. And you would play holier than thou with customers. If anybody has ever seen the movie
High Fidelity.
Thank you. My brain kept wanting to say, it's Say Anything.
I knew what you were going for.
It's Say Anything. No, anyone who's seen High Fidelity and the way those guys act, that is very much the case. A little less abusive to customers, but it's very much the case. And we would get into this purity spiral of like, well, when it comes to rock music, really, Led Zeppelin was the pinnacle. Music does not need to have progressed past that. And that would be me. And then somebody would jump in with, well, what I think Bill was trying to say is that British expression of American blues was the penultimate expression of rock music. But really, the pinnacle of it would have been, Derek and the Dominoes, early Clapton, Cream. And then somebody will eventually jump in and say, well, no, that was all stolen from blues music from the 1920s and 1930s. So that's what you should be listening to. Well, I have to say, if that is the OD&D of modern rock, I'm sorry, I might not win any friends here, but it's terrible. Nobody is going back and listening to recordings of blues musicians from like 1915 and 1920. I will absolutely tell you straight up, those men were innovators, and it's wonderful that a lot of their music has been rediscovered. And if people like that, that's fine. It is not the best expression of that. If Led Zeppelin is AD&D and, Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters and so on are OD&D, I'll take AD&D any day of the week.
Yeah, dude, you're spot on. You're spot on. And if you take that, that comparison there or analogy, and you look at, I think OD&D exactly the same thing, which is there's this, I think the OSR thing kind of created, somewhere out of it, we came up with this mythical person who's had the 3 brown books since 1974 and, saw AD&D as a money grab and never moved on. Like, dude, that's like 2 people probably in the entire world.
Yes.
Right.
I know one of them. He's a nice guy. Yeah. I know one of them.
Yeah. Like that dude didn't exist. Like people trying to rationalize, like, kind of the gaps in OD&D, as being like intentional or whatever. It's like, no, they printed what they could afford to print. Like AD&D is actually like the actual vision for what D&D would become, right? Like yes. That's what Gary wanted D&D to be. It's just like at that point when they printed the books, dude, like, I mean, there's historical evidence that they were like running out of cash and shit, right? I mean, that, absolutely. Yeah. So like OD&D was like poorly edited and very small in scale, not deliberately as like some form of art. It was literally a financial decision, right?
Yeah. Yes, it absolutely was. And there's, I left half my analogy on the table, but you hit on it with, there's like 2 people. The hipsters who claim to love this, come on. At the end of the day, the guys who are like, I only watch silent films made in Germany in the Weimar period, and I only listen to blues music that was originally recorded on wax cylinder. Come on, give it up. Okay, they're doing it for brownie points. They're doing it because everybody's, ooh, how unusual, because you're not going out and getting, CD copies or even vinyl reissues of Houses of the Holy. You're some special untouchable guy who has dipped his hands into the into the wellspring source of all. And it's the same with OD&D. And I found that a lot, not all. One of the 2 people I know, or one of the 2 people you mentioned rather, and I know him, is a sincerely nice person who doesn't hold it over people's heads, his OD&D thing. And he's not like an ancient dude. He's not like some fossil. But I get it. But I saw this pop up a lot in the early 2000s, and there was like this race to reductivism of like,
Totally.
I use outdoor survival and chainmail. That's the purest expression.
Like,
That's
so
the
dumb,
purest
right?
expression of AD&D. Oh, and some notional things someone told me Dave Arneson once said. That is what D&D is supposed to be. And I'm like,
Yeah.
so that's a huge misconception. I think you're
Dude,
right.
it's a terrible one. Yeah. And related to that, so when you get into the whole, like that whole like phenomenon you're just describing, related to that, something I read as a kind of a follow on to it is also AD&D kind of comes with like a tone or a feel that isn't super pliable, right? So it's like if you've got like an idea for a Conan campaign, go to OD&D, right? Don't try it in an AD&D game or whatever. Or you want to do Lord of the Rings, don't try and do it in AD&D because it's got a specific feel and all this. And it's like my response to that is like, dude, I think tone and feel is something that happens at the table, virtual or physical, right? Like,
And I touched on that.
Is it,
go ahead.
yeah.
I'm sorry.
Is it gritty? Is it epic fantasy? Whatever. Like, dude, that happens at your table, right? Like that doesn't happen in the book. And like I've never played with a play group where we opened the book and like pointed to like passages in the book and like backslapped each other. Like I've just never seen that. Like all the flavor and tone comes from the game and specifically from like the dungeon master, how they describe the game and the situations they present to the players, etc. Like that comes from them, not the book. Like I just call BS on like, oh, if you want to run something that's not Greyhawk, you got to use OD&D. Like, no.
I mean, there are rules baked into AD&D. There are rules baked into AD&D for how to run AD&D in the Wild West and how to run AD&D in Gamma World and how to run beings and things from the Wild West and from Gamma World in AD&D. I'm agreeing with you. So, but whomever you are, don't tell me that this misconception is true, because it's not. That's why it's a misconception. Even if you don't like Greyhawk, even if you're not a fan of AD&D, you cannot look at the giant selection of campaign rules just for first edition that are tonally different from the core rules of AD&D. And I'll slightly disagree.
Absolutely.
I think there's a verve and a cadence to the AD&D rules that lends itself to encouraging a certain play style, but it is ultimately up to DMs to determine where they want to take it. There is Conan, Lankmar, and this is all for first edition, Dragonlance, Forgotten Realms.
Yeah, those are Forgotten Realms. Yeah.
Those are as different from one another as peanut butter from jelly. They're both things you can put on bread, but or
and
bake with.
They all work, and it comes down to a matter of taste. Like, so I think it's funny that you can have like the Greyhawk campaign setting and the Dragonlance stuff all in the same game system. Like that's pretty flexible.
Yeah.
That's really flexible. And it's like, what are the changes you make? And I know this isn't where your channel goes. I won't go too far here, but like if you wanted to be more of like, you wanted to do like an epic fantasy Dragonlance kind of thing, you can make like pretty minor changes. It's like maybe like training might be something that's like, hey, this doesn't really fit like my save the world thing. Like, so you know what? Give away less treasure and don't require training. Like the game doesn't break, right? Like if that's what you want to accomplish for that campaign, the game doesn't break.
Precisely right? So. And I mean, if we want to, in my channel, normally, my channel, my Discord, my discussions, my gaming life does not go there. But let's open up the umbrella even further. Let's stretch this out all the way out to 1999. Then we've got Ravenloft, Al-Qadim, Spelljammer, Birthright. The list just goes on and on of game types. one of the hugest fan favorites of ever created for second edition AD&D. I've never played it, I've never seen it, but it's Planescape. Planescape is at its core AD&D. I could change one or two things and run Planescape with these rules, with a 1977 Dungeons and Dragons rules, with very little.
Look at that formula. That mechanical formula was so valid that it lasted all the way till like 99 or 2001 or whatever.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I mean, you've got second edition there, but dude, so much of that is like the window dressing stuff. And at the core, you know, you're still rolling high to hit, you're still rolling high to save, you're still rolling for surprise, you're still rolling for initiative, you're still picking pockets, you're still memorizing spells. Like, you know, there are changes, yes, and I'm not advocating one way or the other, but that's just like proof of sort of like the durability of the AD&D system, right? It lasted that long.
Absolutely.
For so many purposes, you know?
Absolutely.
It's just so flexible. So flexible.
So, I mean, yeah, in a nutshell, right there, it's there's no, you know, there's no ice wall around the flat earth that is AD&D, okay? It's, there is no flat earth AD&D. It is a sphere. It is a globe, all right? And you can travel all over it and get anywhere by going in any direction. So set aside the misconception that only OD&D offers you this infinite diversity and infinite combinations. I found myself, I started an OD&D campaign. Back in 2004, 2005, with the notion that I would, that I would run the game, in OD&D for a while and then transition to AD&D, or maybe stick with OD&D. A very hipster approach that I was guilty of at the time. And I very quickly found myself, as I was hitting forums and I was asking people, and the response was generally, well, lol, just make it up. Well, that's, you know, when I would hit the wall on certain understandings of the rules, it's like, you know, okay, well, how do I do this? Lol, just make it up. Well, how much of that are you going to throw at me before I'm not playing something that resembles D&D at all?
Yeah.
You know, and I don't buy into the philosophy, and no one should, that Gary's ultimate intent was to throw a gotcha at players and say, ha, you didn't need rules at all. So why did I spend $10 on this set of badly edited rules if I didn't need them? If you were trying to teach me some lesson about play, that philosophical navel gazing drives me up the wall.
Yeah, all you suckers that bought the AD&D hardbacks, right?
Yeah, that was either a Tim Kask or a Mike Mornard thing that he and Gary were sitting around laughing as they created increasingly ridiculous rules to suck money out of people. Yes, TSR was a for-profit company, but if they had just wanted to put out shit to annoy gamers, I don't think that D&D would have had the legacy it does.
Yeah, clearly the goal is to make money, right? Like you said, it's a freaking business, you know? So of course you're going to put out product. Like, you're not doing it like also denouncing your potential customer, like, these idiots will buy anything, man. Like that, you know, that's clearly not the intent.
Oh, yeah, definitely not. We have a few comments in here. I don't want to.
Yeah.
I'll just throw these out.
Let's go through them. Let's go through them because I didn't see them. So if you want to read them off.
So this goes back a little bit. This is I think Jack is touching on something a little bit larger here. Jack Photon says, do games need permission slips and waivers these days? I'd be scared to kick a player out for any reason these days, lest they come back with some real dice damage against the group. You know, there's a lot of rumblings, particularly on the media sphere, in the culture comp, the culture war, that you, the general you, have to create a gaming safe space.
Oh,
especially at a
dude,
con.
this
And
is
I think,
so ridiculous. This is so ridiculous. I saw something the other day. Someone created like a virtual tabletop extension or module or something. It's like basically it gives the players like a trigger warning button or something where they can tell you they don't feel safe about the content you're getting into. And I'm like, who the hell wrote this and why? Like,
yeah,
dude, this is so ridiculous,
I
right?
wouldn't be
Um,
surprised to see that in D&D 5.5, that basically, particularly
First chapter.
the player's handbook, in the player's handbook. And like that was one of
Yeah.
the great offenses of 4th edition was, hey, just tell your DM what you want them to do. Like if by 3rd level you want your character to have a Holy Avenger, just tell your DM. And then in the Dungeon Master's Guide for 4th edition, hey DMs, your players are going to come to you with a list of the magic items they want. Be sure to make sure they get all these things.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't
What's
be.
is funny? What's is funny about that is like there's some truth to it, only in the sense that like you'll come to me and it's like, hey, I want to play this type of character or whatever, and I kind of like they're based on some fictional character, let's say, like you've done like Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser with me before,
Yes.
right? So that plants a seed for me that I will place some things in my campaign later down the road that add to your story. But it's not you filling out a form and me acknowledging it and doing exactly what you say. Like there's a nugget of truth in there, right? That you're aware of what your players want to get out of the game,
I mean, what your players want to get out of the game versus here's my list of things you can't do in your game. Here's my list of magic items that I must
Right.
get in the game. You're never, it's just, again, I think 5.5 is going to be that with a little exponent symbol next to it. Ricky Maru says, I find AD&D needs editing too. Yeah, as a multi-decade AD&D DM, I will say unequivocally, yes, you have to edit as you go. And once you have your edits, generally they stick in your head as to how you're doing things. Now, I have found in the past, and this goes right back into what our esteemed guest was talking about, misconceptions, and what Kyle and I have harped on about changing rules in AD&D that didn't seem to make sense. A lot of the things that I made mental edits for, once I really understood them after so many years of not understanding them, I said, oh, I don't need to do this anymore. I don't need to have like a die roll for that anymore, because right here on the other page. But that, of course, loops back around and supports what you're saying, Ricky, because if it was a little bit better edited, I might not have made that misconception.
Yeah, and that's just it is what it is, right? I mean,
Yeah. Imperial Ramblings says, my opinion has always been, and not just for AD&D, it's my game. I'll play it how I want. Perfect. Perfect.
that's it.
Semoli loves him some Planescape Torments, and it seems to be a fan favorite, and I salute the people who use Planescape. What I really love about Planescape Torment is a very as my co-host on Wednesdays, Kyle Schuant calls it, it's very thespian, very and he means it is throwing a bit of shade, but I think it speaks volumes that you can take the AD&D core and play a game of high drama and intrigue like Planescape Torment with the simple old AD&D rules. That goes back to the flexibility of AD&D. And then Damien says, Mistara does have a setting with the Mistara setting does have a hollow world. That's, I think, referring to our flat Earth, or my flat Earth comment earlier. But, yeah, I just, I think you've really hit on some good bullet points about AD&D misconceptions. It is more flexible than people present it as, and it is just as capable of presenting a fantasy setting has the most complex rule systems. And I would say even better. Look, I played a lot of Rollmaster and a fair bit of RuneQuest in the 90s. I had friends who didn't want to play AD&D. Russ, have you ever played any? I feel like I've been running my mouth.
Rollmaster?
Yeah, Rollmaster.
No, I've not played it.
You haven't missed much. I would look at a game like Rollmaster with its tons of skills and abilities and say something like that is far less flexible a game system just out of the box as an out of the box experience than AD&D is. That's just my 2 cents on it. Adam says, everyone's favorite D&D is the first one they play usually. I stand a little bit outside of that because my first D&D was just a copy of Keep on the Borderlands and me to try and figure out what the rules to the game were supposed to be. I didn't have a rule book. I just had Keep on the Borderlands and some dice. But in the overall, I think there's probably some truth to that.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say anecdotally, I my first like few months of D&D was actually like the Menser box, like the red box set, you know, which is no longer my favorite version of D&D, but I think it's ultimately true. Like the era, maybe it's more like the era, maybe not the specific game, but like, you know, if you grew up playing D&D in the 80s or 90s, you're likely to like those better than others, you know. I don't know.
Sure.
Something to think about.
Sure. And we've kind of reached time now, and it's funny where when people talk about D&D from their childhood or D&D that uncles or older brothers or cousins or even parents were playing when they were just tall enough to reach up on the table and grab some dice, they're talking about 3rd edition. And that just kind of blows my damn mind.
Dude, there's an entire like 3rd edition nostalgia thing out there. Totally.
Oh, get out of town. A 3rd edition nostalgia?
Dude, like it's almost been 20 years, hasn't
it? Silence. You will hold your tongue and speak no more. It was just a couple of years ago that 3rd edition came out. It is not nearly 20 years old.
Isn't it? Or am I off?
No, it was 2000. It was 2000.
Yeah.
It came out in the summer of... Was it the summer of 2000 or the summer of 2001? I feel like it was the summer of 2000, but I could be wrong about that because I did it drop at Gen Con 2000?
I mean, that's a good point. I wasn't paying attention to it at that point, so.
Oh, I mean, it's not a big deal. Just kind of an interesting touch on trivia. Let's see. Paul's got a good comment here. Thespy is one of the reasons people shy from AD&D. It doesn't have to be a LARP, but if people aren't developing a voice for their characters, you're playing numbers in a situation. I think it can be, but I think ultimately the voice for your character is not something that's built into any one game. I mean, what I call just nuts and bolts AD&D running the numbers might be like Kyle might be pulling his hair out saying, no, you're playing too Thespy. I'm sorry, Kyle, that was awful. the accent, everything was awful. I'll have to apologize to Kyle tomorrow night for that. But no, the point that I'm getting at is it's just what tonally fits your group. I think there are game systems that are better suited for others. I don't think you could play a bloody Shadow of the Demon Lord type game using the Blue Rose rules. But that's entirely up to you. I'm straying. I'm straying. Ricky says I'm in that group. Please don't be so derogatory. Lol. Ricky, are you threatened? Are you feeling threatened, Ricky? I'm sorry.
Was the question about like using voices and stuff and whether that is necessary? Was that the point of it?
I'm sorry, you broke up a little on my end. What were you saying again?
Oh, was the question about whether using voices in character is like necessary or I
Oh,
wasn't sure what the
no,
point of
no,
the
no.
comment.
I think the Thespy part was like, high role playing. I think there's a degree of there's a point where, like, if you bring 5 pages of backstory about your character to the table, and you're posturing like Sir Laurence Olivier every time it's your turn. It's like, okay, Bob, what are you doing? I'm going to draw my long sword, and am I close enough to attack, or do I need to charge? You're about 15 feet away. I'm going to say that, yeah, you've got a long sword, so you can get over there and attack. Great, okay. Mary, how about you? Oh, I'm staying in the back casting magic missiles. Okay, Bob, how about you? Oh, 'tis a fate that I would not wish on any others. I shall draw forth my cloak of concealment, and creeping thus, find my... And it's like 5 minutes later, you're like, oh, okay.
Dude, we're not playing Mazes and Monsters. Come on.
Yeah, get up off the floor, Tom Hanks. You're scaring the dog.
There's probably a happy medium, right?
Find a happy medium. It's whatever works for you guys, okay? I love to see player enthusiasm. Just when you're playing a tabletop game, play a tabletop game. If you want to go LARP. And I think it can be a lot of fun, just depending on DMs. But Paul makes a salient point. I get numbers and action quicker and better from video games. That's your competition. It always has been, Paul. The year or 2 years after original D&D came out, a little company in Cupertino, California, sold this wedge-shaped beige computer, and then a company out of Pennsylvania the next year sold this big boxy white computer, and they were the Apple II and the Commodore PET 2001. I promise you, the first thing that the purchasers of those did was sit down and try and figure out how to get Dungeons and Dragons into those machines. And indeed, early issues of Dragon have type-in computer programs, DM assistant programs, early DM assistant programs in BASIC that you can type in. TSR was very quick. Most people think that the SSI Gold Box games were the first TSR games, but it's not. They had a dungeon board game that preceded those, a Dawn Patrol game that preceded those, and one called Theseus and the Minotaur that preceded those. People were striving to get their fantasy fix out of their television, which was most people's computer monitor, almost from the get-go. But the one thing is, as power and that is like literal electrical power requirements and system requirements and complexity of software has increased, this has stayed consistent. You need this, you need these, you need at least a couple of friends, and that's it. No DLC required, although I will admit there was plenty of DLC for pen and paper games right from the get-go. I am sure people who had bought OD&D and played it happily for a year and then saw Supplement 1 Greyhawk come out were like, what, are you trying to soak me for more money? You couldn't just like have given me those rules for free?
No, so they all rejected it, right? They rejected it because it was a money grab.
Because of the purity. The purity of OD&D must not be corrupted.
Yeah.
Dungeon is a great game. Epix had Temple of Apshai. Temple of Apshai was friggin' fantastic. I loved Temple of Apshai. And let me tell you what, the early D&D-like computer games on computers were not shy about strength, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity, constitution, charisma, weapons and armor that ran from +1 to +5, hit points, monster names. They just lifted it whole cloth right out of D&D. Ricky also says, I grew up playing 2E. I cut my teeth on 3.0 and I hate 3.5. That's cool. I get it. I completely get it. Shadowrun might be the king of written DLC per edition, that or riffs. Oh boy, he said the magic R word. This is where the ping pong balls fall down on Rusty. He said riffs, Russ.
Yeah. Let's do like a side trek episode on that someday.
We're gonna get Russ on. We're gonna talk about riffs one day. You've done it now, Damien. Now you've done
Yep.
it. So welcome to all of our viewers, by the way. I see we've got 8 now, which is a pretty good gig. I was fortunate enough, Rob, to have Temple of Apshai on floppy disk. Even as nightmarishly slow as the 1541 was, it was night and day over cassette tape. But anyway, I'm sorry, guys. I'm on and Rusty too. I'm on like a laptop screen size standalone monitor here, so managing my tabs to get back over to where I can ask questions is sometimes a little difficult. So what do you think with all this? And I think I'm sorry, I was going to attribute the wrong person there. I think, hey, there's Mr. Grooves. Good to see you, buddy. I think Paul said it best when he was talking about competing with, competing with video games. I've always felt that pen and paper has always done its level best to compete with computer. Yes, computer games are a multi-billion-dollar industry. You could dump the entirety of the role-playing games hobby into one budget for one game from one AAA studio, and it would rattle around inside. It wouldn't cover their lunch budget, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But video games have never taken pen and paper away. D&D has grown. What is the way going forward? And I'm not talking about new D&D. I'm talking about AD&D. What is the way going forward, Rusty, that you see for AD&D? What is a path for growth for AD&D in the future?
Yeah, quickly, I just want to comment on the video game thing, though. I think the deal is like before you had video games that were like D&D, like, there's some portion of your D&D fan base and player base that loved grinding through levels to get gold and beat monsters. Like, that's what they liked the most out of the game, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the transition to like something like Diablo is really easy. It's like, dude, this does what I like about D&D better than D&D does. Like, you're never going to get them back. Like, that's just a fact, right? Like, RPGs are just something else. Like, there's more to it than that. If you're not interested in the other things, go play the video game, right? I think that's I think that portion of the fan base or whatever is just unrecoverable, if that makes sense. But in terms of moving forward, and I do have to drop her some work stuff here, but I think moving forward, man, I go back to what we talked about in the beginning, that if you're going to grow AD&D as a kind of a fan base group of hobbyists, more players, more products being sold, whether they're under an Ozark label or what have you. Like, I just think that you gotta, overall we have to do more with digital tools. Even things like streaming. How many AD&D games get streamed and are actually high quality? Not a lot that I know of. I mean, if I find some online, like on YouTube, it's like the production value maybe isn't there, and things like that. So I really think, digital tools. And what's funny, we talked about video games a little bit. Like, to me, some of the automation you're getting through VTTs, there's an overlap there where it's like, hey, I can actually run AD&D for you, and I'm doing very little bookkeeping and math and stuff because my VTT like figures out that he's got a bless spell on him and he's wearing chainmail armor, and I've got a +2 because of flanking. It figures all that stuff out and just gives me the result, right? Things like that, which I think you're getting more video gamey, but you're focusing now on the fun parts, not the bookkeeping parts. So anyway, I guess it's kind of related, because I think that push into digital, virtual tabletop, something like D&D Beyond, don't release products that don't release products that don't have like a good digital map and tokens, things like that. I think those are the things that are going to kind of push this forward. I mean, there's probably a lot more, but that's kind of my point of view right now. And I do apologize. I do have to jump for work at this point.
I understand. Rusty, thank you so much for coming on the show today and taking time out of your day. When you come back, not today, obviously, but when you come back on the show next, I think we'll tackle some points. You probably had a dozen things more that you wanted to go over. We'll talk some more, a little bit on the topics we've got, and maybe dip into a little bit of riffs, right?
Dude, let's do it.
All right. Thanks again to our guest, Rusty Schafer. Rusty, always a pleasure to have you on, man, and we'll see you around the Discord. Peace.
All right, man. Thanks. See ya.
All right, and that's just about going to do it for me today, too, folks. Thank you, everyone. We had a great audience today. Thank you all so much for participating. Hit the Discord. If you didn't know, we have a Discord. We do have a Discord. Let me just share that with you guys real quick here. Come on by. We'll have some great. I'll have some great conversation about this episode, about future episodes, about just whatever tickles your fancy, because that's the way I roll. I'll just drop this link in here real quick over for our friends that might be listening or watching on Facebook. There's that for you. And, of course, for our excellent audience on YouTube. Tomorrow night, the return, once again, of Kyle Schuant, my Australian co-host, will be here. And we are going to hold court on many different things. You better believe it. So come by tomorrow, crack a tube, put your feet up. We'll throw another shrimp on the Barbie, and that'll be a lot of fun. Thursday, for those of you who have been, but I want to know what happened in the Monday campaign. Thursday, I'll catch you up, I promise. And we'll talk some more about Greyhawk Gods on Thursday. It was an hour. I was hoping to get him for like 90 minutes today, but work be work. But thank you guys, all of you, for being here. You can go back and watch the videos. It'll be there. You just put it on the YouTube bleep bloop. Speaking of YouTube, before we go, let's check. I feel like a telethon. I feel like Jerry Lewis, is the tuxedo with collar popped and the thing hanging, and it's like we are currently at. Although it's for far less, it's for far less noble a cause than muscular dystrophy. 806 subs. That's nice. 806 subs. We are 194 subs away from the mini convention, from the virtual mini convention, the great underground virtual gaming con is ours in 194 subs. So tell your friends, tell your family, hop on over here, subscribe to the channel, click subscribe, click the notification icon, watch the videos, give me a thumbs up if you like the video, give it a thumbs down if you don't like the video. That's cool. I understand. Leave comments. That helps with the YouTube algorithm quite a bit. And we will get there to 1,000 subs. And when we do, we're going to celebrate good times. Oh, yeah. Y'all have a wonderful day. I love you all. Thank you for being here. Thanks to everyone for the great questions. Guru said, I posted up those Grenadier guys for you on K&K. I will check those out. Can't wait to see them. So, yeah. Yeah, thank you all, everyone. And I will see you tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. Peace.